Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Imam, another episode, another conversation on the arguments for God. And today I wanted to just go back to the book you wrote, the Imam M.A, the Atheist. It must have been incredibly challenging to write the chapter where you discuss this legendary, this mythological argument for God, the ontological argument. How was that?
I rather enjoyed it, actually. I feel like the very abstract theoretical nature of the argument made it more exciting for me. Also, I think the dialogue format of the book makes it easy to kind of present the argument and represent it and weave it again and address every aspect of it, and then the uncle is asking questions and the imam responds, so you really get full clarity, I think, in the end.
You get to hear the concerns as they arise, and I'm hoping that we can do that today, because this is one of those arguments that I think goes over many people's heads, even after they think they understand
I venture to say, actually, most people haven't even heard of it yet.
And I personally would like for you to do so with me, so that I can really understand the argument in depth today.
Definitely, and I hope that our viewers will be excited. And if I did, half a good job in the book, I think people should be able to figure it out.
Yeah, so can we talk about the ontological argument? So what is this? Where are we exactly?
So ontology is a branch of metaphysical philosophy.
Okay.
So philosophy as a branch of knowledge is divided into these different categories. The philosophy of ethics, aesthetics.
Let's talk about each of those real quick. So, philosophy of ethics.
I don't know if we need to discuss all of them. Just to give you some examples. The philosophy of ethics basically tells us on what basis we should ascertain what is moral and what is not moral in terms of human behavior. Political philosophy obviously applies to the realm of politics and governance and so forth. The philosophy of aesthetics is about what is beautiful and what is not beautiful. And of course there's the metaphysics, which basically is the branch of philosophy that studies all these aspects of knowledge beyond the physical world. And so, we've been talking cosmology and teleology, right? All of this would be included under the branch of philosophy that is metaphysics. Questions about God: does God exist? What are the categories of existence? What is reality, or what are the different forms of reality? The relationships between things that do exist and stuff like that. These are, basically the types of questions that metaphysics is interested in asking.
Right.
And within metaphysics, there is ontology. And ontology basically focuses on the very fundamental question of what is existence in the first place? What is reality? What is being? Right? Al-kaynuna in Arabic, being, for something, to not be and then for that thing to be. What does that really mean? And so let me give you an example. For instance, just that our viewers are able to fully figure this out. We'll take an apple, for instance. You're sitting in this field, right, in this orchard. I don't know how you got there in the first place, but you're sitting under the shade of an apple tree. And then, suddenly you're thinking about your life and your future, just like Newton did. You're scratching the back of your head, wondering what your wife made for dinner that day. And then this apple falls.
Okay.
So you grab the apple and you basically ask a series of questions.
Yeah. Who threw this at me?
Well, it fell from the tree,
okay.
right? So hopefully no one particularly threw it at you. But if you ask the question, how did the apple fall? The mechanism by which the apple fell, then this would be a question of science, right? The process. Physics.
Right.
And if you ask, why did the apple fall? Perhaps God caused the apple to fall and be my rizq, for example.
Like the purpose of the apple falling.
Exactly. The why questions, purpose, and so forth. Then these are entirely theological questions beyond the realm of science. You're not sitting in your own field, so you know that this apple tree is not really yours. So if you ask yourself, is it moral for me to eat the apple? Then that would be a question of the philosophy of ethics. If you basically ask yourself, if I took a bite of this apple right now, is it going to be delicious? What is the meaning of delicious?
Yeah.
This would be, aesthetics, right?
Beauty.
Beauty.
Right.
And if you ask yourself, does the apple actually exist? Right? Am I really sitting here under the tree? Right? Does the tree exist? That's a question of metaphysics. Ontology would focus particularly on the question, what does it mean for the apple to be?
These are questions of existence.
It's a question of existence.
So
what is the definition of the very being of the apple?
Ontology then is the study of being.
The study of being,
existence.
actually in Greek, ontologia. Onto is being, logia is study. It's the study of being.
Okay, this is particularly exciting because in this series we are seeking to demonstrate the existence of God, to understand the arguments that make that claim. And if we're in the realm of studying existence itself, and we're trying to talk about the existence of God, this should be the most straightforward, the most direct way to demonstrate the existence of God. Is that right?
Also the most robust. I mean, I said earlier that I rather enjoyed writing the ontological argument. There's power about it because the ontological argument uses only reason and rationality to ascertain the existence of God. It does not use empirical evidence, cause or design or purpose. And if the ontological argument holds, it would actually be the most sound of all arguments because it would just be a matter of reason. Doesn't matter what happens in the empirical world, the argument will remain strong and will remain the same.
That would be incredible.
That's why I actually love the ontological argument a lot.
To who do we owe the credit for this, or at least the formulation of this argument?
The one and only Saint Anselm of Canterbury, this Italian priest of the 12th century, we owe so much to those incredible doctors of the church, right? We talked before about Saint Thomas Aquinas. So Saint Anselm is another priest, basically, and another philosopher that developed and weaved the ontological argument in the 12th century and completely rocked the world. And to this day, here we are hundreds of years later, so many philosophers all over the world have formulated and reformulated and presented different editions and different versions of the ontological argument, and it's still alive and well today.
And the version that he demonstrated is still effective.
It absolutely is. It took some battery over the centuries. It has a couple of bruises, a couple of black eyes. Yet it still survives. And with the modern formulations of this argument, it continues to be pretty strong.
Okay, I'd like to get into it. Do we need to do any groundwork? Do we need to discuss anything to make sure we're all on the same page before we get into the discussion?
Yes. And just to set the ground for this, I want us to, all of us, you and I, and also those of us who are watching the video, I want us to go through this basically thought experiment where we have 4 concepts, and I want us to think about those 4 concepts, right? So the first concept is a married bachelor.
Okay.
Yes. The second concept is a horse. The third concept is a unicorn. And the fourth concept is God, right?
This is the beginning of a horrible story.
Yeah, I know that it at face value, it seems like there's absolutely nothing that ties these 4 concepts together, but I will attempt to create a common denominator between them. So the married bachelor, the horse, the unicorn, and God, what is the one thing that ties all these concepts together? They're all ideas.
Okay.
They're all ideas. That's their common denominator. But these ideas are different from each other in terms of their scope. And so some of these ideas are ideas that exist in conception, conception alone, and some of these ideas exist in both conception and reality. And there's one particular idea that exists in neither, right?
Conception nor reality.
Neither conception nor reality.
Yeah.
And so if you take, for example, the idea of God, I know that at least it exists in conception. Even if you're an atheist, you heard the word God before. You have some concept of God in your mind. You say that God doesn't exist in the real world, but at least the concept, the idea of God is in your mind. It's not like you haven't heard of it before.
So
right?
those who are, this is to speak to those who are maybe not convinced of the idea of God existing in reality. You're not saying that God exists in reality here. You're just saying that God is an idea that we can think of.
That's it. That's all I'm asking you to concede to. That God at least is an idea that exists in the mind, even if it doesn't exist in the real world.
And atheists would be okay with this because they when they argue about God,
they debate the idea of God every single day, and you cannot debate something that doesn't exist, at least in your mind, as a concept. If you take the horse, for example, everyone would agree that the horse exists in both conception and reality. It's an idea in the mind. You know, even if I have never seen a horse before, maybe I've seen a picture of a horse on a wall, I have a concept of the horse in my mind, and I see that horse in the real world as well. I go to the stables and I see the horse or whatever, then I have it both in mind and in reality. The unicorn, as an idea, exists only in conception. All of us know that there's no unicorns in the real world.
We've never seen one.
We've never seen one. There is absolutely no proof that any of them exist. This is a figment of our imagination.
Sure.
The fourth one, which is the married bachelor, is an idea that exists in neither the mind nor the real world. We cannot have any conception of someone who is both single and married. We cannot have a conception of a circle that is a rectangle.
Yeah, by definition, it contradicts itself.
Exactly.
Right, so a square circle is not possible.
Absolutely. And so these are basically four ideas to set the ground for the ontological arguments. Some ideas exist in neither conception nor reality. Some ideas exist only in conception but not in reality. And some ideas will exist in both conception and reality. And the ontological argument attempts to show that the idea of God exists in both conception and reality as well.
All right, but we haven't done that yet because we've so far only agreed with everyone, I think will agree, that the idea of God is one that at least exists in conception, whereas the horse, it's obvious to everybody that exists both in conception, we can think about a horse, and in reality we can go see and touch a horse.
Right. And, one of the other things that I also wanted to say, before we weave the argument is that ideas that exist in both conception and reality must be more useful and more helpful than ideas that only exist in conception. Wouldn't you agree?
Generally, I think so. A horse that is in my mind is, or actually a horse that is in reality is probably better than a unicorn that's only in my mind, or more useful.
Right, and I mean, think about it, you can have all these fantasies and all these dreams about riding a horse. But actually riding a horse on the beach would be much cooler. It
would be incredible.
Right? In fact, you mentioned unicorn. If the unicorn only exists in conception, well, it's a fancy idea. I can have dreams about flying and everything.
Right.
But if the unicorn actually exists in the real world, and I can ride a unicorn and then tell the unicorn to take me to France, I mean, that's, well, maybe not France, let's say, Istanbul.
Okay, that sounds incredible.
That would be much cooler than the unicorn only residing in the mind, but actually has no reflection in the real world. So this is another premise that is really important. Again, we're building the groundwork for the ontological argument. Going back to God, with this in mind, there is that one idea that is greater than any other idea or any other concept or any other paradigm that ever occurred to man. And that is the idea of
God?
Of God.
Okay.
Like, we can't think of any idea that is greater than God. There is no house that is greater than God. There is no galaxy that is greater than God. There is no universe that is greater than God.
Yeah.
The maximally greatest idea on earth, the maximally greatest idea in any mind in the entire universe would be the idea of God, even if you're an atheist.
Right.
Even if for you God doesn't exist in the real world, but as a concept, you cannot think of a concept that is greater than the idea of God, regardless of who you are. Can we agree on this?
I think the atheists would agree. Even the most staunch of atheists will say that the idea of God, this greatest possible being, this maximally great being, as we're saying now, is an idea. And it's a rejected idea for the atheist.
Right.
Okay.
But it's still the greatest idea that the mind of any human being could ever conceive.
In conception, in imagination, it's the greatest.
Right. And that's all I need
Okay.
in order to start weaving the ontological argument for you. So we're ready?
I think we're ready. Let's do this.
All right, so it starts with a series of premises, and then there will be a conclusion in the end. And you know, we go basically as follows. And I'm not going to use the exact wording of Saint Anselm, but you know, I will be as close as I can.
Okay.
All right. So we start by saying ideas can either exist in conception alone, or in conception and reality. We've established that before.
We're good to go there.
Right? And then we would say ideas that exist in both conception and reality are actually greater than ideas that exist only in conception.
Okay.
Right? The idea of God is possible because at least it can exist in conception, even if it doesn't exist in reality.
Right.
Right? Number 4, the idea of God in both reality and conception would be greater than the idea of God only in conception.
Agreed.
All right?
Yeah.
If we say that God exists only in conception, then we're basically saying that there is another idea greater than the idea of God that exists in reality.
Okay.
Because we've established earlier that the maximally greatest idea ever would be the idea of God.
Right.
And so if the idea of God exists only in conception, then there would be another idea in reality that is greater than the idea of God, and this is absurd because it contradicts one of our premises.
Yeah.
Therefore, the conclusion is, if the idea of God exists in conception, then the idea of God must also necessarily exist in reality.
Okay, hold on a second. I followed you. I was with you every step of the way, but that just seems impossible. It just seems like you pulled a rabbit out of a hat. How did we get here?
Was there any premise I shared so far that you disagreed with?
When you described every premise, I thought that I understood it, and I felt comfortable with it.
Did you disagree with the transition from one premise to the other?
No, but maybe going through it a little more in detail would help, because I must have missed something.
By all means.
It seemed too easy. It seemed too... why haven't we been making this claim the whole time?
The way we have, it's just maybe you haven't heard.
All right, well, let's go piecemeal, because I think we need to clarify each premise so that we can certainly say that this argument works.
Okay, yeah. So again, let me go through this one more time. So premise number 1, ideas can either exist in conception alone or in both conception and reality. So for example, the unicorn would represent what?
An idea that exists in conception alone.
Right, and an ogre would be what?
Well, some people, no, I'm just kidding. An idea that exists in conception
Yeah,
alone.
like Shrek, for example. That is an idea that exists only
in conception.
in conception. There's no Shrek in the real world.
Right.
What about an apple? We talked about apples earlier.
An idea that exists in both conception and in reality.
Horse.
Conception and reality.
God.
Well, I want to say conception and reality,
Right.
but at least if I'm having a conversation in common ground with an atheist, we'll agree that it is an idea that exists in conception.
Very good.
At least we're there.
Which is good for now, right?
Okay.
Premise number 2, ideas that exist in both conception and reality are greater than ideas that exist only in conception. Can we agree to that?
Ideas that exist in both conception and in reality are greater than ideas that exist in conception alone.
Right.
Can we give an example?
Like, for example, like I said earlier, if there's a unicorn in the real world, riding an actual unicorn would be actually much cooler and greater than the idea of riding a unicorn that only resides in my mind.
Yeah,
Can we
so a
agree to
real
that?
unicorn, although it's not reality, but if it was a reality,
It would have been greater.
It would have been better, more useful,
Absolutely.
more fun, etc.
That's what I would say. And I'm not a girl.
Okay.
But unicorns would be the absolute most coolest thing ever.
We'll accept it.
Premise number 3, God is an idea that at least exists in conception. We've already established that. Regardless of whether you believe in God or not,
yes,
God is an idea. It's an absurd idea for some, but it is an idea nonetheless.
It is an
idea. Right? Premise number 4, the idea of God is the absolute most greatest idea that could ever occur to any human being.
So this is the definition of God in a way. This is what we mean when we say God. is the greatest idea. An idea is so great that no greater possible idea could be conceived.
Absolutely not, right?
A being so great such that no greater a being, entity could be conceived.
And if the mind could conceive of a greater being than God, then that greater being would...
Well, that would be God.
Then that greater being would be God, because the assumption is that God is the greatest being that was ever conceived by the mind or ever existed in reality if you believe in God.
Right.
But if you did not believe in God, at least you have to accept that the idea, the concept of God is the greatest thing that was ever conceived by the mind. And if there's any idea that is greater than the concept of God, then that idea would be the concept of God.
Right. And we could do this, someone else says, no, this is a better idea. Well, that whatever is that greatest idea, and greatest is the key word here, greatest, that's God.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Premise number 5, the idea of God in reality is greater than the idea of God in conception. I think we've already established that with regards to every idea, but I wanted to specifically apply that to God.
The idea
Agreed?
of God in reality, that if
God
God
exists in both reality and conception, then this would be greater than God existing only in conception.
I see. Yeah, so if we're just saying that God exists in conception alone, then God existing in conception and reality, that would be a greater idea. We can conceive that and we would say that's greater.
I think even the atheist would agree. The atheist would say, well, I don't believe in God, but if God did exist in the real world, then that would be greater than just a mere thought of God in my mind. Right?
Agreed.
Premise number 6, if we say that God only exists in conception and not the real world, remember what we said earlier, anything that exists in the real world will be greater than anything that exists in the mind. So if I said that God only exists in conception, He does not exist in the real world, then I'm essentially saying that there's another idea that is greater than the idea, greater than which nothing can be conceived, which is absurd.
That's a contradiction.
That would not make any sense. It would contradict our premises so far. Again, let me restate this. So premise number 6 basically says, if we confine God to just a mere idea in conception, and we say that God does not actually exist in the real world, then I'm making an assumption that there is essentially another idea in the real world that is greater than the idea of God, which I have just established is the greatest idea that the human mind ever conceived. So I'm saying there's something that is greater than the greatest ever conceived, which would be an absurdity.
That's a contradiction.
Right?
I see that.
Which basically leads us to the conclusion of the argument, which is, if the idea of God is the greatest idea ever conceived, and if that idea cannot exist in conception alone, because if it did, then there would be another idea that is greater than the greatest idea, then the conclusion has to be, if God exists in conception, then God must exist in reality, necessarily.
That is incredible, and I understand it. It seems like it should be too easy, but I think it makes perfect sense.
It takes a bit of work, I think, and it takes a bit of development, and people have to watch this video multiple times. They need to go back to the book and read. They need to go online and read. It takes quite a bit of getting used to, but once you do grasp this idea, it'll be exhilarating.
And it's an incredible idea because just the argument itself it seems unique compared to the other arguments that we've made.
Because we did not have to look at the design of creation, we did not have to look at cause, we did not have to look at purpose and anything like that. We just used our minds. That's it.
Yeah, that in a way, no matter how much science changes, or no matter how much we learn about the universe, or about morality or anything, all of those things leave this argument unaffected.
Not only that, I personally, as a man of faith, I personally think that this is the one argument that offers and affords God the greatest amount of reverence.
Yeah. It
is the most deferential idea to God, because cosmological, teleological, whatever, they're still using the creation of God to prove God. The ontological argument uses God to prove God.
Yeah.
And it establishes that God exists by necessity.
Yeah.
He must exist. I don't need anything else to prove Him. The mere idea of God is a reflection of God's reality.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about this argument a lot.
It honors God in a way. without needing any of the inferior creatures, and their natures or anything like that to demonstrate God Himself. I think that is quite beautiful.
And another point that I mentioned actually in the book is that the ontological argument is only relevant when we talk about the maximally greatest being. We're not talking about anything that is great, but rather anything that is the absolute greatest. This argument cannot apply to anything else. It only applies to the greatest being, the greatest idea, the greatest concept that could ever be conceived, just so that there's no confusion about that.
It only works for God.
It only works for God.
Can't do it for a unicorn.
It absolutely can't, because I can only imagine a bigger unicorn with longer horns. It can't work for anything else. It can only work for something greater than which nothing can be conceived.
So, this is incredibly robust and incredibly reverential, but there must be some others who struggled with it, sincere philosophers who came up with refutations and challenges to the argument.
Yeah, there has been definitely refutation against this argument. And one of the refutations that I would like to mention is, something that I alluded to earlier, which is, some philosopher basically came and said, Saint Anselm basically defines concepts into existence. Just because I can think of the idea of God, or that I can conceive of the idea of God, that means that God exists in reality. Which basically is tantamount to saying, if I thought of a huge island and basically wills that island into existence, that island would actually exist.
Right. If you think of the greatest possible island.
Right.
And then you use this argument, then you would come out with the greatest possible island must exist.
And now that we've discussed this, how would you respond to that refutation in particular?
Yeah, I think that, I'm wondering about the meaning of God versus the meaning of the island. Right? The island is not the greatest possible being, right?
The island is finite no matter what. Right?
Absolutely.
Because when you think of an island, for example, or the greatest elephant, really, for that matter, or the greatest galaxy, or the greatest universe, I can always imagine adding a rock or a pebble to the island to make it bigger. I can always imagine adding a drop of water to make it bigger.
Another palm tree.
Another palm tree.
Coconuts and stuff.
Exactly.
Right.
And so if the object is still susceptible to change into something bigger, then that object is not the maximally greatest object that could ever be conceived.
Right.
Whereas God is, at least in the mind, right, has reached the absolute most utter perfection that you can't imagine adding anything to God, because God is already infinite. And so, for all practical purposes, going back to the island example, if the island was infinite, and if the island, is so perfect that no additional pebble can be added to it, because it has an infinite number of pebbles, and it has an infinite number of, palm trees or whatever, then essentially what we're really saying is that that island is
God?
I don't want to say that, but, at least in an abstract sense, you're basically saying that this is God, because there is nothing that is more infinite than God. So again, this argument does not apply to anything that is finite, or anything that can be subject to increase.
So like you said, if you take the island and you give it the quality of being infinite, you give it the quality of being timeless, right? Other qualities that we would have been giving to this greatest possible being, well, then you're actually just talking about God.
Yeah, so just remove the word island and put the word God.
Right.
And so we're not willing, an elephant that is as big as Jupiter into existence. We're not doing that. We're basically saying that, this is something that only applies to the Creator of heavens and earth, no one else, nothing else, 100%.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the concept of God, then, does everyone agree on this definition? This when they say God, does everyone mean the same thing?
See, we talked earlier about the philosophers of the church, and we've had a tremendous amount of reverence to St. Thomas Aquinas, and while he was so engaged in proving the existence of God in his own right, on his own, through the cosmological and the teleological arguments. St. Thomas Aquinas was actually in disagreement with St. Anselm of Canterbury, and he rejected the ontological argument.
On what grounds?
His take was basically, not everyone, when you say the word God to them, would afford God the same amount of reverence that you and I do, and think of God as the maximally greatest being. It's funny coming from a Christian, because
I was going to say that.
He probably talks about his own people, or we think of God as having a nose and a mouth and a beard and hands and stuff like that. There is a finitude about our conception of God, whereas your argument basically says that God is this maximally greatest being, and so how does that work?
Yeah.
But I'm actually quite surprised that something so silly like this, with all due respect, comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, because, dude, we can just remove the word God and put the maximally greatest being ever conceived.
Right.
And this will resolve the entire issue. And so if you're bothered by the possibility of someone attributing a human image to God, or some kind of a finite conception of God, let's just do away with that. And we will remove the God from the entire ontological argument, and we're just going to say...
we'll say Allah.
Possibly,
yeah. How about
possibly,
that?
right?
Yeah.
Because, for Muslims, the word Allah is never associated with anything that the mind could ever imagine. This is for us the absolute most maximal being that the mind could ever conceive. And the argument would still hold, and be robust, sound, 100%.
I think it's worth considering that St. Thomas Aquinas has an issue with this argument presented by St. Anselm, just in the idea that there are many people who associate these limitations, or they have, whether it's idols or whether it's other forms of God, these limited conceptions of God. And this argument is not interested in defending those limited conceptions of God, right?
No.
This argument is interested in defending the greatest possible being that could ever be conceived.
And that's why I keep repeating that premise. Right. That is really important. We have to confine the scope of the ontological argument to the absolute greatest, most maximal being that the mind ever conceived.
Honestly, it makes me feel a little warm inside. It just reminds me of the phrase Allahu Akbar. God is the greatest.
It really does, but I don't want to burst your bubble, because there is another refutation for the argument that comes from...
Let's stop here, because I'm happy, I'm satisfied.
Not yet. There's still some more work to be done.
We need to do the due diligence.
Our dear friend Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, even though he was a man of faith himself, and he actually has his own argument for God that we will discuss in another conversation, but he did, I think, deal a great blow to the ontological argument, and almost did away with the ontological argument. Almost.
So it's not a fatal blow.
No. The ontological argument did actually survive the blows of Immanuel Kant, but his, I think, posed the greatest threat to the ontological argument.
Has nothing to do with the image of Christ or anything like this?
No.
Okay. Well, then
he was a Christian, but the strange type of Christian. He was a very philosophical Christian.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. This is what Immanuel Kant basically said. He goes after one of the premises of this argument, and basically this premise says that God, in both existence and reality and conception, is greater than God if God is only confined to conception, right? We said that earlier, right? And actually this applies to any idea.
Right.
An idea that exists in both reality and conception is greater than an idea that exists only in conception. So you're saying that the concept of God, if God exists in the real world, then God would be, then that would be greater than God existing only in conception.
This seems to be the most harmless of the premises.
Not for Kant. So he basically says what Anselm essentially did is that he made existence into a quality, into a predicate of the object.
Okay.
So let me use myself, for example,
Yeah.
as an object, for this analogy. So Imam M.A is tall. This sentence has how many qualities of Imam Aziz, or how many predicates of Imam Aziz?
Tall, so 1.
According to Anselm, Imam Aziz is tall, is being,
He exists.
and tall is tall. So according to Anselm,
There's 2 then.
Kant would say that this statement has 2 qualities of Imam Aziz and not 1. And Kant would say existence cannot be a quality of an object because existence is a prerequisite, it's not a predicate. An object needs to exist first in order for that object to have qualities. And so existence is not a quality of God the way red is a quality of a strawberry.
Just repeat that last piece. Existence is a prerequisite, not a quality. Could you explain this a little bit?
According to Kant, you cannot, because if existence was not a prerequisite, if existence was another quality of an object, just like its color and its taste and its size, then saying Imam Aziz doesn't exist and Imam Aziz is tall, those 2 sentences would make perfect sense.
I see.
But saying Imam Aziz doesn't exist sort of like, eliminates any other possibility of Imam Aziz acquiring any additional qualities. He doesn't exist, therefore I don't even know if he's tall or red or handsome or amazing or cool or awesome.
You're a great guy.
Right? And so he has to exist first before we attribute qualities to him. God needs to exist first before we attribute qualities to him.
Yeah.
But according to Kant, St. Anselm says, God, if God exists in both reality and conception, we already know that he exists in conception, but if he exists in reality, which means that he really, really exists for real, this would be greater than him existing only in conception. But wait a second, you're basically saying that existence is a quality of God when existence is a prerequisite. He has to exist first before he starts taking attributes.
Right.
And so he tries to shoot down the ontological argument on grounds of using existence as a predicate, and he almost succeeded.
So just to understand it in the most layman's of terms, you can't talk about the color that your horse is if you don't have a horse.
If the horse doesn't exist in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? Because existence, according to Anselm, is existence according to Kant. Is a prerequisite before the object is even ready to acquire any qualities.
Okay, this does seem fatal, and I'm quite upset.
It is not fatal because St. Anselm, turns out, had a different formulation of the argument that was not as popular as his first one. And it was that formulation that had the magic formula to save the argument.
St. Anselm himself has dealt with this.
It's just so weird. He
That's
had
incredible.
so many different versions. He imagined the type of refutations. And he had so many versions of the argument, and so many philosophers that came after him, Leibniz and Spinoza and Plantinga, all these guys that came later, they actually they used his other formulation, and they developed very, very robust versions of the argument. So in that formulation, St. Anselm avoids using existence as a predicate, but he qualifies existence. And he uses necessary existence. And necessary existence can be a predicate. Ordinary existence, mere existence, is a prerequisite. We understand that.
Right.
But if I made existence necessary, if I made existence something that cannot not happen, then that can be a quality and can be a predicate, and then the argument is saved, the premise is saved, by qualifying existence into necessary existence. So you would basically say the idea of God, if he necessarily exists, meaning must exist, not contingent upon the existence of something else. Existence existing on his own, with his own power, with his own will, right? If God necessarily exists in the real world, this would be greater than God only existing as an idea in conception. He qualifies that existence.
Yeah.
And actually, with that in mind, we agree with Kant. If we're just talking about existence alone, then existence by itself would be a prerequisite, not a predicate. But if we're talking about qualifying that existence into necessary existence, and we're saying God must exist. I mean, the strawberry doesn't have to exist.
Right.
The horse doesn't have to exist. But we're talking about an entity that, number one, is the maximally greatest entity that can ever be conceived, and an entity that must necessarily exist. And basically, in that particular formulation, we are able to dodge Kant's bullet and say, well, this is not just ordinary existence. This is a qualified form of existence, which is okay to be a predicate.
So this is the difference between mere existence and necessary existence. And you're saying that necessary existence is a quality of God, we'll say, or the greatest possible being.
Right.
Can necessary
and it doesn't have to be a prerequisite. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be. It's almost like, you know, you're saying awesome existence or meaningful existence or exciting existence as opposed to just mere existence.
Right.
Mere existence would be a prerequisite of qualification, and awesome existence would be a predicate.
Right.
And so it's okay then for the argument to continue. Premise number 4 is saved, and the conclusion still holds.
Incredible. Can we just reiterate this, the argument with this formulation, with the necessary existence as the quality of God?
You mean the entire argument, or just this particular?
Just this particular.
Yeah. So you know, God necessarily existing in the real world would be greater than God existing only as an idea in conception.
And even we could say, God necessarily existing in the real world is a greater idea than God merely existing in the real world. The necessary existence is actually a greater quality.
It definitely is, but I mean, we still don't want to compare a predicate with a prerequisite.
That's right. Yes.
We want to compare a predicate with another predicate.
Right.
And so we will play along with Kant, and we will assume that mere existence is a prerequisite. We're not going to include it here. We're just going to talk about, you know, necessary existence as a predicate, as a quality, and the argument is saved.
As opposed to possible existence.
As opposed to possible existence or mere existence or ordinary existence.
Right.
This is, you know, the most awesome of things. You're basically saying that this being cannot not exist.
Mm-hmm. Right.
God must exist. And so the conclusion would be, if God exists as an idea in conception, then God must necessarily exist in the real world as well. Actually, this makes the ontological argument even stronger and more robust.
It sounds incredible, and again, it offers such reverence to God. I really, really do love this argument now that I feel that I understand it.
And I hope that you know, those who are watching this video have understood the argument as well. And if you're having a hard time, you can always go back to the notes and the book and take another look.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Once again, Imam, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.